30 years ago, your computer was obsolete in 18 months. Now people game on decade-old hardware and barely notice. Star Wars showed us this exact future, and we called it bad writing. Two real phenomena, one fictional, one playing out on the machines in your home. Same curve, same physics, same destination. This isn't a defense of Star Wars world building, it's a prosecution. The verdict was already reached by anyone paying attention. What follows is the evidence you need to win every argument the next time someone confidently informs you that the galaxy far, far away forgot how to innovate. One thing stated once, without apology. When this script cites lore, it cites legends. The expanded universe, novels, comics, sourcebooks, encyclopedias built across decades before Disney purchased Lucasfilm in 2012 and reclassified everything that followed the original films as non-canonical. That decision created a hard line in the fandom, and this script stands on the correct side of it. The galaxy we're discussing, the one with 25 millennia of documented spacefaring civilization, the one where technology has had genuine geological time to mature, lives in legends. The physics we're about to present work regardless of which timeline you prefer. But the lore evidence is drawn from the deeper, more fully developed universe, and getting the argument right demands it. So, the accusation. Across tens of thousands of years of in-universe history, through the Old Republic, the Clone Wars, the Empire, and the Rebellion, the galaxy's still flying variations of the same ships, still pointing variations of the same blasters, still jumping between stars on technology that looks essentially identical to what was used millennia earlier. Critics present this as a failure of imagination, lazy world building dressed up in a used universe aesthetic. They're describing a real observation. Their interpretation is completely wrong. The legend's chronology places continuous galactic civilization at somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 years of essentially unbroken development. That figure emerges from synthesis of the legend's timeline, rather than a single, clean primary source. And honest EU scholars will tell you the exact number carries some uncertainty. But even at the conservative floor, 25,000 years changes every calculation. The oldest confirmed continuous human civilization on Earth traces back roughly 6,000 years. Every empire, every revolution, every breakthrough from the wheel to the microchip fits inside 1/4 of the span of galactic civilization in the Legends timeline. A civilization that cracked faster than light travel near the beginning of that span and spent the remainder operating on it didn't stagnate. It finished. There's a difference, and the difference is everything. Freya Kalea established the Hydean Way, one of the major hyperspace routes connecting the Outer Rim to the galactic core, in 3705 BBY. 3,705 years before the Battle of Yavin. The people who mapped those routes are as ancient to the characters in A New Hope as Phoenician sailors are to us. FTL travel in the Star Wars galaxy isn't a recent achievement being refined toward its potential. It's infrastructure. It's the road system. It's something so old that the people using it have no more reason to revolutionize it than a 21st century driver has reason to reinvent combustion mid-commute. The Outer Rim reflects this perfectly. Communities living in conditions that look pre-industrial by Earth standards still carry blasters as standard equipment. Critics see this as contradiction. It's the opposite. It's confirmation. 25,000 years of interstellar commerce and conflict means advanced personal weapons technology has diffused so thoroughly through galactic civilization that it's reached even the most economically marginal settlements. The blaster on the hip of a Tatooine bantha herder isn't evidence of a broken distribution system. Advanced weapons tech is ambient. It's old enough and cheap enough to be everywhere, the same way iron tools reached medieval European peasants who couldn't smelt iron themselves. A technology that's won completely leaves exactly this kind of footprint. It becomes background radiation, present even where nothing else is impressive. The Legends material is specific about how that distribution worked. The Outer Rim absorbed technological diffusion through centuries of trade route expansion along corridors like the Hydean Way. Settlement communities on planets like Tatooine didn't manufacture blasters locally. They received them through supply chains so old and so established that the origin points were themselves ancient history. The infrastructure wasn't broken. It was so mature that it required no maintenance of the supply logic itself, only restocking. That's what a 25,000-year-old technology ecosystem looks like from the inside. It doesn't look innovative. It looks like furniture. In 1965, Gordon Moore observed that transistor counts on microchips were doubling roughly every 2 years, delivering proportional computing gains at roughly constant cost. For decades, that pattern held. If you bought a CPU in 1997 and kept it through 2000, your hardware had been comprehensively outclassed in every benchmark. Games that ran well at launch were already straining the machine 2 years later. Intel's tick-tock model delivered generational leaps on a schedule consumers could plan around. Every 18 to 24 months, the new generation wasn't incrementally better. It was transformatively different. Then physics started saying no. The move from 14 nanometers to 10 nanometers at Intel stretched from an expected 2-year cycle into a 5-year ordeal. Transistors were approaching the scale of individual atoms. At that scale, electrons tunnel through barriers they physically shouldn't be able to cross, and heat generation scales in ways conventional cooling can't manage. Dennard scaling, the principle that said shrinking transistors also reduced their power consumption, enabling the essentially free performance gains of the Moore's Law era, had effectively ended by the mid-2000s. The free lunch was over. What remained were expensive, incremental gains that delivered diminishing returns on the investment required to achieve them. By the early 2020s, the consumer hardware landscape looked nothing like the upgrade treadmill of the early 2000s. Mid-range hardware from 2020 remained genuinely competitive years past the window that would have made it obsolete in the classic Moore's Law era. The cycle that once ran on 18-month legs stretched to 5, 6, 7 years across millions of households. New generations still released, benchmarks still improved. But those improvements were refinements, measurable gains at the margins, rather than the doubling every cycle explosions of the earlier era. The curve bent. Not because anything broke, because it was doing exactly what physics said it would do when you approach the fundamental limits of what matter can be made to accomplish. That's the Star Wars galaxy. That's what 25,000 years on the same curve produces. The critics watching it from the outside see the flat part of the line and call it stagnation. They're standing at the bottom of our own curve, looking up at the vertical climb, and can't yet see that the vertical part ends. For approximately 5,000 years, from the domestication of the horse around 3,500 BCE to the steam locomotive in the early 19th century, the fastest a human being could move over land was roughly 30 to 40 miles per hour under ideal conditions, on fresh animals, on good terrain. A Roman legion's cavalry moved at the same fundamental speed as a Persian army 1,000 years earlier. Napoleon's supply lines operated at the same basic pace as Julius Caesar's. 5 millennia, one ceiling. No one called it stagnation. It was the infrastructure of civilization, and it worked. Then, between roughly 1830 and 1969, humanity went from the Liverpool and Manchester Railway to Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface. Horse to steam to diesel to jet to rocket, in a span shorter than some individual dynasties. That's the S-curve. And it's deeply tempting to look at that climb and assume it represents the natural direction of things. That technology always accelerates, always opens new paradigms each generation. The anomaly is the climb. The baseline is what happens after. The Boeing 707 entered commercial service in 1958, cruising at roughly 570 miles per hour. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner entered service in 2011, cruising at roughly 560 miles per hour. 53 years of continuous aerospace engineering, and cruising speed went backward by 10 miles per hour, while improving dramatically in fuel efficiency, range, and safety systems. The Concorde pushed briefly into supersonic commercial flight and was retired in 2003 without a successor. The exponentially greater fuel cost bought only marginal time savings, and the economics couldn't be sustained. The speed plateau in commercial aviation isn't a failure of aerospace engineering. It's physics asserting hard limits on what combustion can accomplish in atmosphere at viable scales. Apply this to the Star Wars galaxy's FTL history. The hyperdrive climb happened, explosive and transformative, so far back in galactic history that the people who achieved it are mythological figures by the time of the films. What remained after the climb was refinement, better navigation charts, more reliable hyperdrive motivators, increasingly granular mapping of routes already known. Legends sources document this refinement across centuries of measurable advancement in hyperdrive capability. That progression spans thousands of years and represents genuine engineering advancement. What it doesn't represent is a new paradigm, a discovery that made hyperspace itself obsolete or revealed a travel method the galaxy hadn't previously conceived. The category was fixed. The refinements were real. This isn't a distinction without a difference. This is the exact same pattern we're seeing in our own aviation sector, playing out on a civilizational timescale. The observation that the closer you get to the apex of any technology, the more effort and time is required to gain a fraction of improvement. That's not a philosophical position. It's what physical limits do as you approach them. Researchers studying pharmaceutical development named the phenomenon Eroom's law, a deliberate inversion of Moore's law. The number of new drugs approved per $1 billion of inflation-adjusted R&D spending has roughly halved every 9 years since the 1950s. More computational modeling, more genomics, more molecular biology deployed, and each newly approved drug grew more expensive to discover. The accessible biological targets were solved first. What remained were harder problems, rarer mechanisms, more complex interactions, each returning proportionally less on the resources required to address them. Semiconductor development shows the same curve. Each successive process node has taken longer and cost more to achieve than the generation before it. The improvement per dollar spent has shrunk consistently as the node has shrunk. Approaching the physical limit doesn't make progress cheaper or faster. Every incremental gain costs more and delivers less than the one before it. The Landauer limit, the thermodynamic minimum energy required to erase one bit of information, a floor below which the second law of thermodynamics forbids computation from operating, establishes a hard physical ceiling over computing efficiency. We're nowhere near that limit today, but the trajectory of processor heat generation across decades illustrates the broader principle. As you refine a technology toward its physical ceiling, the losses mount faster than the gains. The Star Wars galaxy, from first principles, completed this process across virtually every category of technology that matters. Blasters still look like blasters because the fundamental physics of directed energy weapons was settled long before any character in the films was born. HK-47, the assassin droid from the Legends-era Knights of the Old Republic games, represents what mature droid technology looks like at its apex. A system so thoroughly optimized through millennia of refinement that it requires no further development, only deployment. HK-47, documented across the Knights of the Old Republic games and supplementary Legends material, is one of the clearest examples of this pattern. A product of engineering so complete that it required no further development, merely deployment. And because this prosecution is honest rather than selective, things do change in Star Wars. Weapon power scales upward, ship classes grow. Death Star construction began in 20 BBY, producing a station roughly 160 kilometers in diameter. Death Star 2 measured 200 kilometers. In the Disney timeline, Starkiller Base pushed to 660 kilometers. TIE fighter variants multiplied across the Imperial era. Hyperdrive class ratings improved across generations of military craft. None of this is denied. What didn't change, what couldn't change, because the physics ran out of paradigms to shift, was the category of technology itself. The galaxy moved from one blaster to a better blaster, not from blasters to something that rendered blasters obsolete. It moved from faster hyperdrives to faster hyperdrives, not from hyperspace to a travel method that made hyperspace look primitive. Refinements are real. Revolutions stopped arriving because the physics stopped permitting them. The Empire built a bigger Death Star. It didn't discover a new principle of energy generation. A civilization in a technology plateau doesn't stop building things. It builds bigger, faster, more refined versions of what it already knows. That's what the real-world evidence says mature technology does. Every time, without exception. Now. In a conference room aboard the first Death Star, hours before the Battle of Yavin, the substance of what Vader told the assembled officers has been quoted by audiences of the 1977 film for nearly 5 decades, and it amounts to this. Don't be too proud of this technological terror you've constructed. The ability to destroy a planet is insignificant next to the power of the Force. Every person watching this knows what happened next. A Force-sensitive farm boy from Tatooine, a kid who had grown up so far from the center of galactic civilization that he had never held a lightsaber until less than a week earlier, flying a snub fighter against the most heavily defended military installation in galactic history, turned off his targeting computer and fired one shot. One shot. Into a thermal exhaust port 2 meters wide, at attack speed. In a battle that the Empire's finest pilots and the Empire's finest computational targeting systems had failed to win in the preceding hours. The station that began construction in 20 BBY, that represented 20 years of Imperial engineering at full industrial scale, that could destroy planets, destroyed by something no engineering budget can replicate and no transistor node can manufacture. The Force has no R&D curve. It has no physical limit in the conventional sense, no equivalent to the thermodynamic floor Landauer identified. It doesn't scale with investment. Vader told the Imperial officers exactly what was true, and then a 19-year-old from a backwater moisture farm proved it in the most public way imaginable. Vader accidentally ran the experiment himself. He was the one who let Luke reach the exhaust port. The machine failed. The Force did what the machine couldn't. The critics who point at Star Wars technology and call it stagnant are looking at the factory floor and missing the actual power structure of the galaxy. The galaxy that gave blasters to uncontacted communities on the Outer Rim did so because blasters are solved problems. Ambient infrastructure, old and cheap and everywhere, delivered through supply chains that predate any living memory in the films. The galaxy that mapped hyperspace routes through the Hydean Way 3,705 years before the Battle of Yavin did so because FTL travel finished its explosive S-curve so long ago that the routes have proper historical names, and the explorers who charted them are as mythological as Phoenician sailors. The galaxy didn't fail to innovate. It innovated completely, hit the ceiling that physics imposes on all technology eventually, and continued operating in the plateau the way every civilization does when the climbing stops. Our Moore's law curve is flattening. Semiconductor development costs are scaling exponentially for fractional gains. Commercial aircraft have flown at the same speed since 1958. Pharmaceutical pipelines are producing fewer breakthroughs per research dollar than they did 70 years ago. Every piece of evidence critics deploy against Star Wars as proof of creative failure is happening to us, in verifiable data that any engineer will confirm. The galaxy far, far away modeled the most realistic technology trajectory in science fiction. Not because anyone was prophetic about physics, but because a galaxy old enough to have solved its own engineering problems looks exactly like what ended up on screen. They were confident, the critics. That specific confidence that comes from being wrong for a long time without correction. The physics corrected them. The data corrected them. And a farm boy with no targeting computer corrected the most powerful military installation in galactic history in the same motion. Star Wars didn't get the future wrong. It got it right 25,000 years before Luke Skywalker was born. We're only now catching up to the proof. Subscribe for more stories like this.